What's the E word? It's the E in DEI that everyone ignores, but we're here to bring it to the forefront. Welcome to the E word. I am doing well. I'm enjoying it,
I know
enjoying the day.
it's a beautiful day, but we're here because we're always here to talk
Yes,
about what's going on in the world.
we are.
And something crazy happened just a few short days ago, right?
You're gonna have to narrow it down because it feels like something crazy is happening multiple times every day. So can you break it down for me, please?
You're right. So I'm referring to the National Association of Black Journalists
Mm,
and their event or conference that our Republican presidential nominee had joined. And some of the
yes.
controversial statements that he made regarding the Democratic nominee, Kamala
Huh.
Harris.
Hmm.
That's the kind of crazy I was talking about.
Okay. Now, I'm
Now,
with you. It's all coming back to the foreground. So I should note that the Democratic presidential nominee or presumed Democratic presidential nominee did not attend. Had it seems to be some sort of conflict, scheduling conflict, and so there was the option to only have our Republican presidential nominee there, and the choice to have him speak was pretty controversial, right?
it was, and in all fairness, the NABJ has had nominees and presidents there that,
Mhm.
from both sides of the aisle in the past, some of which
Right.
have, I think, made some controversial statements as well. But I don't know that it has been of the ilk, right, of this one. And maybe it's because, this is the, second time in history, right? Potentially, in terms of person of color, of having a multiracial background. And for some reason, that is confusing to people. And
Mm.
when I say people, I mean all people. I mean white people. I mean Black people. I mean all people are somehow confused that a person can be more than one thing. And I'm confused by why that's confusing.
Yeah, yeah, because we've had multiracial and biracial people in the United States since before the United States became the United States and before our current iteration and understanding of race, because race has not been this static definition throughout the history of the United States, right? It's evolved over sometimes decade to decade
Mhm.
to match the evolution of the country.
Exactly. So his statements about the fact that Kamala turned Black, I
Mm,
guess to appeal to, the Black voting bloc, right?
hmm.
And that she's always promoted her Indian heritage is also another divisive tactic, right? To
Hmm.
separate not only the general population of people of color who can identify with all sides of her. As we talked about last week, she is multifaceted in not
Hmm.
only her identity from demographic perspective, but also just her family structure and extended family. But it's also a tactic to divide us as Black people. And I think that that part is the most confusing to me, that we as Black people are confused about her multiracial identity or biracial identity. And I want people to understand, one, the definitions, okay? Because
Yes.
maybe that's just, there's, as you just talked about, race being a social construct, right? Fine that there might be some confusion around what those things mean, but also recognize that it is being used as a tool for a greater purpose, and that we shouldn't fall into that trap.
Yes, correct. Quick question before we dive into that.
Yeah.
At what point did you turn Black, and what was that experience like for you?
Yeah. I think from the womb.
Yeah.
I think from the womb. However, I will say, so my parents are Jamaican.
Right.
And by extension, I am, because Jamaica recognizes citizenship through just one grandparent. I have two parents that have immigrated from Jamaica.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so I identify as Black and Jamaican, right?
Yes.
But I, in my earlier days, was told, well, you're not Black, you're Jamaican.
Mm-hmm.
And that has been said to me more than once. Okay.
Yes.
When I was younger, as a little bit, less so now, right? Because, people are a little bit more educated around that. But I was like, what are you talking about? Right? Like,
Right.
those are two different things. Okay. So I've been hit with that, and it's just really been odd. How about you? When did you turn Black?
Yeah. So, I'm going to have to go with conception, the womb. I am someone who would be considered Black American, meaning that my family, my nationality, I'm a citizen of the United States, and my ethnic origin, right, is of Black American ethnic origin, meaning that the cultures, the language, the vernacular of Black Americans is what I was born into. And so my ancestors have been here quite literally for hundreds of years. In fact, I have an ancestor who was one of the first Black people to be, Black women to be formally recognized in a court of law as a human being, because she sued her, she was an enslaved person who sued her white owner because her white owner impregnated her and refused to acknowledge and or care for the child. And so there was the question of, what do we do, right? And if we are to hear this claim, we are tacitly, accepting her humanhood, her womanhood, right? Her right to be heard in a United States court of law.
Yep.
And so when we talk about this concept of being biracial or being multiracial, understanding that it has real impact, because at that time, and for very obvious purposes, if a white person, a white man impregnated an enslaved woman, her children would more often than not be considered enslaved.
Right.
And that was just, a numbers game, right? Because it increased your enslaved population. And so again, America, or the United States, before it became the United States, had to wrestle with this concept of what to do with people who are embodying both identities. And what do we do with a child fathered by a white man, right? Born to an enslaved woman? How do we reconcile that? So it's been a fascinating evolution to see whiteness and blackness evolve throughout the United States and society and law.
That's a really great point. I mean, especially the legal implications of all of that. And, you know, it's interesting. I was talking with a friend of mine. She's from the South. And, you know, of course, in the South, the one drop rule applied.
Correct.
And for those that don't know what that is, that basically meant if you had one drop of Black blood in you, you were considered Black. And that was to prevent Black people from trying to pass as white, although, you know, some of that happens. Right. But, and that is a construct also that has been very pervasive in our times and clearly still lingers today. And that's why I think you have certain groups saying, well, she's not Black, she's Asian. But this idea that you have to choose is very interesting to me, right? So
yes,
we typically talk about biracial people as being Black and white, right? Black, right?
Yes.
And because of this one drop rule, you chose this, or you chose based on what you looked like, right? At the end of the day, how is society going to treat you? If you looked Black, claiming that you were white in the society that we lived in and continue to live in, is not going to fly because we are a racialized society, right?
Correct.
So we don't really too often talk about other races mixing.
Yes.
I think it's a beautiful thing, but we don't usually talk about it in that way or as often. And so you have Kamala Harris that represents these two communities, and people are trying to define her when it's her job to define herself.
Correct.
And she doesn't have to choose at all.
Right.
Right. Both things, but we're asking her to be one and critiquing her because she's not choosing one over the other. Why does it have to be either or? Why can't it be and?
So this is fascinating for a few reasons. One, of course, is the rejection of nuance, which is a pervasive thing that we're experiencing throughout our society at this point. Everything's very polarized. It's either quite literally Black or white, good or bad, one or the other. And we're doing ourselves a disservice by denying the complexity and celebrating being multifaceted people who embody a number of identities, because she self-identifies as a Black woman, right? She honors herself as a South Asian woman, as a multiracial woman, as a stepmom, so there's so many different aspects to who she is. Additionally, when we talk about the one drop rule, and we talk about race, we have to remember the phenotyping is so important, because to your point, you can be multiracial, you can be biracial, and that may not match someone else's understanding. So there are countless people, I want to say, 1 in 5 white Americans today have a Black ancestor, right? And it's because at some point in time, there was intermixing, and one's ability to pass or to, be accepted into white society and forego their Black identity, tended to have certain benefits. That was not always something that worked in people's favor, but it happened. Additionally, even if you were biracial, if you did not fit a phenotypical understanding, meaning that your skin was a bit more melanated, then was deemed acceptable, and you couldn't pass as being Mediterranean or, somehow some sort of exoticized other, then you were relegated to being Black. And this is especially fascinating to me because my thesis in law school applied the traditional tenets of property rights to race.
Mm.
So when you think about property law, the main tenets of property law is the right to control, the right to enjoyment, the right to disposition or destruction, and most importantly, the right to exclude.
Mm.
So my thesis at the time was that Blackness as a concept, if we looked at Blackness as a property right, was not in fact, or traditionally not owned by Black people. And that if we're honing in even on one of them, the right to exclude, we've seen that throughout the history of the United States, Black people did not own that. Right? So you had miscegenation laws, you had laws that govern one's identity. So you had traditionally the historical term of mulatto, which meant a half white, half Black person, and was called mulatto in reference to a mule because it was traditionally thought that people who were half white and half Black were so outside of the bounds of nature that they could not reproduce. Of course, we know that's nonsense, but nevertheless, it happened. The idea of a quadroon, someone who was 1/4 Black, or an octoroon, right? Someone who was 1/8 Black, and what that meant. But none of these racial distinctions were set by Black people. And so when I look at these conversations, when I look at the Republican presidential nominee or the Republican vice presidential nominee attempting to exercise this right over Blackness, to exclude this woman from a community that they're not even part of.
Yeah.
Right? But it leans back into our traditional white patriarchal societal norms, which says these are the people who set the norms. These are the people who own race and get to decide who we can exclude from whiteness and at the same time, assign to Blackness or exclude from Blackness.
Oh my gosh, that's so fascinating. The whole concept of we've never owned Blackness, which is so true. Like, as you were talking, I'm like, who even came up with Black, right? Like that
Right.
doesn't exist really too much on the African continent. Who came up with that? And how did it become so pervasive?
Mm-hmm.
How did that become our norm? And you're so right. Like, we were never, since being brought to this country in that position. And the big question is, how do we take it back? Looking at Kamala, especially when it's been so ingrained in us, right? But
yes.
Looking at Kamala, and she doesn't really talk about her race in general, right?
Correct.
Obviously, she's identified, as you said, as Black and Asian American or South Asian. But that's not the center point of her platform, right? Because
Correct.
it doesn't need to be, because we all have eyes and we can see it, which
Yes.
again is a dangerous notion, right? Because we can't
right.
who people are. I mean, my ancestry DNA says I'm about 10 to 12%, white, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think anybody looking at me would say that, but technically I could claim to be white.
Correct. And if you checked that off, right? How can someone argue that?
Right. I got my papers.
Exactly. I have genetic proof, and this goes to the heart of why race is so complex and in many respects absurd. However, We made it so real.
Yeah.
And there are very clear indicators. I mean, even as we were talking about Blackness, from a marketing perspective, I'm thinking of Aunt Jemima, I'm thinking of Uncle Ben, right? These signals that we've received about Blackness within the United States, which is typically people who are in a helpful or a subservient position, right? Aunt Jemima is going to help you create a breakfast because, well, you can't, you may not have your own Black cook, but she makes you feel safe. You may not have your own Black cook, but Uncle Ben is here to make sure that you can still receive a nutritious and delicious meal. And we've had to reconcile with that in recent times. We've seen, I think it's called the Pearl Milk Company now, instead of using Aunt Jemima, but whose aunt is she? Who is she related to?
Right? I'm gonna take it back further. That is just an illustration of what already is, right? So going back to that question I just asked about who decided we were Black, somebody decided, and that was the ultimate marketing campaign, right?
Correct.
At the end of the day, they branded Blackness. It's probably one of the best marketing campaigns there has been on here. They branded Blackness and somehow got the entire world to believe
to
that.
Accept it.
Exactly. Now, there are some small branding issues, right? When you come outside of America, right? So, like for instance, I think one of the best books, and actually I listened to it because it was Trevor Noah's book, Born a Crime. And you have to listen to that because you have to hear his voice, and he also talks in his native language. So you have to hear that. But one of the things that's really fascinating that he talks about when he's growing up in South Africa is this: they have a different construct of race, right? And so while Black is still universal, who is categorized in that category more so has to do, yes, with skin color, but also with economics, right? And so you have Black, which I guess you would term full Black, right? Like Black parents, right? Then you have colored, right? Which is a mix of races. And then you have white. But, and this is the part I'm going to get wrong, when they were when South Africa was in negotiations, trade agreements and such with either China or Japan, I just don't remember which one, classification was part of that. And where would they be placed? And one group, I want to say Japan, I really want to say Japan, but I could be wrong, was classified as white because that had the greater economic status.
Right.
So you were classified based on economic status, which at the end of the day, this is what this is all about. Classification boils down to economics and who's going to have power and influence over society. But again, my point being is that racial construct morphs somewhat based on the interests of the country and how they want to utilize race for that power and influence. And we can see when we travel a little bit, like how those differences kind of play out, which can sometimes seem vastly different in the Americas, which was built
on economic interests. And I think when we're talking about race and racial classification and the benefits or detriments that come with it, we have to remember that power is not acquired, it's exercised.
Yes.
And so I think back to your question of, who decided on Blackness at the outset of the 13 colonies, you had indentured servants and you had enslaved people, but for a particular period of time within the colonies in Virginia, you could You could buy your freedom. In fact, you did have, uh, Black settlers that owned other Black people for a limited time. Then you have Bacon's Rebellion, where you have a ton of indentured servants and people who occupied the lower economic classes rebelling against those with means. And that was problematic. So the question was, okay, well, how do we differentiate? How do we say one of these things is not like the other? And that's where we start getting these the emergence of these race laws, right? And now people can't congregate, they can't marry, they can't, hang out in groups. You have this social stratification where Blackness is always at the bottom. And we see the manipulation of that even now, right? Where the pursuit of whiteness it's seductive, and it becomes kind of a part of becoming a US citizen in a way. Because I would say early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, Italians were not considered white.
Right.
Irish were not considered white. You had publications referring to Irish people as having paws, right? So there was something to be seen as something inherently unnatural about this group. But over time, we see that certain groups are allowed, again, into whiteness, provided that they exclude themselves and distance themselves from Blackness. So it's fascinating to me, especially within the Black community within the United States, to have this argument about whether Kamala is really Black, and whether we're in a space where people get to define themselves for themselves, because we see a multiracial woman who went to a historically Black university, joined a historically Black sorority, and has maintained a presence in and connection to the Black community. So then my question is, well, if we're saying that she's not Black, one, what does that mean? And are we all agreed in what Blackness means? And so I guess to bring it back to the conference, I am disappointed that providing that platform to this nominee allowed for the furtherance of a very ignorant idea, which is that, this man who considers himself to be a white American now gets to sow seeds of doubt and dissension within another community that he's wholly been shown to not respect, about who belongs there.
Even if he did respect it, he doesn't need to talk about who belongs there.
Yeah.
On either side of the aisle. And this question, I think that we have to answer, or Black people have to answer, is what were you alluding to? What is Black enough? Right? Mm-hmm. So within our community, what is Black enough? Why are we having this debate at all? Mm-hmm. Right? And outside the community, who's having this debate, stop it. Because to have a conversation about, and there's all these articles about it. I'm like, oh my goodness. So now it's a problem that she's Black. Theoretically, for people who, don't want her to win, right? Her Blackness and acceptance of that should be cool with you, right? Because you think of that as a lower rung within the American caste system, essentially. But here's the problem. You're going to make it an issue, not in the way that you want to make it an issue, because she has momentum. And when you start to tally all of these Black voters, and then you add the Asian voters, right, who are largely Democratic voting blocks, you start to get scared. because, and wait, you have this multiracial group that, I don't know, maybe they checked other on the census. I have no idea. Okay, right? You have this other group, and that's a growing population of people.
Yes.
Right? We are
Yes.
more multiracial than ever. You start to get scared, so you have to sow division to keep us apart. It is an age-old tactic, and I would say a negative, detrimental marketing tactic to do so. But it's very effective because it is so ingrained in our society. You cannot have groups that have mostly been separated, right? What's that movie? It just popped up in my head with Denzel Washington and, what was her name?
Mississippi Masala?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right? It popped in my head. Okay. Right?
A movie before its time.
But it showed like the disconnect between the two communities. And so she is an amalgamation of those two communities coming together. And we're like, oh, okay. Right.
Right.
And
right.
Contrary to what's trying to be believed here, right? Like Black people, ultimately, at the end of the day, we welcome in other groups. We are very welcoming people. Get caught up in the drama sometimes, but we'll talk all this mess. But we're gonna go and do what we need to do for the greater good. But it is, again, I just want to make this point that it is a tactic of division because they are scared of what could happen. And we are also like a growing number in some of those really important swing states, right?
Correct.
So
Correct.
the more of us that are gathering and supporting and all for Kamala is a threat to the Republican side of this argument. And that's the undertone of what all of this. We're real distracted with what is she? She's not this, she's not that. When ultimately, guess what? We don't care, right? We accept it. We just don't. Like, we're just making it an issue. But like when your brother-in-law marries a white girl, we don't care. When your brother-in-law marries the Puerto Rican, we're like, cool, a person of color. Like, we're just accepting. And so why are we feeding into all of this drama? Because they're really good at making something that's a non-issue a bigger issue than it is. And we just have to remember who we are.
Yes. And remember that if I'm assuming positive intent, then I would say it's a misguided attempt to exercise that right to exclude, right? To try to retake the power of owning Blackness, but emphasis on the misguided. And to your point, we are very accepting. We've had to be, right? Because very often there have been other communities that have discarded of their multiracial grandchildren or communities and been very exclusionary. And so we've been welcoming, even when it hasn't benefited us sometimes, but
the learned trait.
But you're right. This tool of distraction and an attempt to keep Americans in this loop of exploring, identifying, and rationalizing ourselves instead of exploring what's next. What is next for us when it comes to welcoming this? We know that there are going to be a the continued growth of multiracial people within the United States. We think it's great. We are increasingly seeing the benefits of celebrating and building bonds between multiple communities, which is great. And we've moved from, I don't know if you've heard the phrase, I used to hear it all the time, and I've even used it, right? The minority majority communities, where we've now moved to the global majority communities because we see the global majority reflected, within the United States. And it can be a really beautiful, amazing thing. if you're open to moving forward
Exactly.
instead of looking back.
Exactly. I think one last point I want to speak to the ADOS community. And
define that for folks watching.
American descendants of slaves.
Yes.
ADOS community is, and I know because I identify as a Black American, but also of Jamaican heritage. So I cross those borders, right? That
you're a stop away.
Stop away. Okay. And there's a lot of trade between the Americas and the Caribbean. So, you know, I just want to say, listen, that I would just ask that you embrace the entire group. I tend to be disturbed by some of the commentary, and so I don't focus in on it as much. So I might be missing some important elements. I just want to say that. There's a flare up around this conversation around reparations and who is owed reparations. I just feel like we shouldn't be talking about that, right? Because reparations are not something that we have in hand, right? We're arguing over something that doesn't exist. What we should be doing is unifying around Blackness, right? And as you said, Brittany, using our collective selves to basically retake it, like take it as our own what Blackness means, and embrace it in the diaspora, because ultimately we know we are all originally from, through our ancestors, the same continent, just spread, you know, unwillingly and sometimes at will in our later years, right? These later things. Across the United States. I mean, across the globe, sorry, but particularly in the United States. And so I just want to say, am asking that group to take a pause, right? We can revisit reparations when they are awarded, right? Revisit that conversation. I understand the differences, obviously, of slavery with here and within other countries. And personally, I'm not, if it were awarded, right, I'm not looking for that particular handout. Right? Sorry, it's not a handout. Let me correct that. For what's due. I mean, there's a lot of articles out, or, you know, in terms of like that recent article about the farmers being paid X dollars, billions of dollars in basically reparations, right?
Correct.
For the discrimination, and that's incredible and that's awesome. And anyway, I'm taking a very long-winded time to say that I just want the whole community to come together and rally around someone who represents so many people, so many different interests. And also another plea is, let's not hold her to a greater expectation because of her Blackness. She's already going to have a lot on her plate when she wins, because I'm speaking life to that. And we just don't want to make it harder. I'm not saying to make it easy on her, but we have a tendency as part of our own internal biases to hold certain groups to a higher account. And we just need to make sure that we check ourselves and be supportive in that way. And also, it's not just about what she's going to do, it's about what we are going to do to support that effort. Anyway, I'm off my high horse on that.
I appreciate you on the high horse, because I don't really think there's anything else to be said. I think it was so eloquently put. So thank you.
All right, well, I just want to conclude with saying I identify as Black, as a Black American of Jamaican heritage. And pretty soon, I hopefully will obtain my Jamaican citizenship as well. So I'll be a dual citizen of America and Jamaica. And I still
love it.
Identify as Black.
Love it. Love it. I will continue to identify as a Black American. And as I said to friends, I'm as American as apple pie. So, so when you look around at Black Americans, again, regardless of what others may think, you see a lot of people who are patriots who are equally, if not more so, invested in the betterment of this country. And I'm looking forward to celebrating your dual citizenship.
I'm going to work on it. Time, but I'm going to get there. All right. Until next time, Brittany.
See ya.